Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. They are gone. The old ones, the architects of ancient order, shapers of life, wielders of psychic mastery beyond mortal comprehension, have vanished into the darkness of time. Their name lingers like a ghost on the tongues of historians and Xeno's scholars, but their fate remains unspoken, their final breath swallowed by the endless night. And standing over their grave, silent and motionless, are the Necrons, cold-blooded lords of death who fought them to the brink of extinction in the war in heaven. The question that whispers through the haunted stars is not what happened to the old ones, but whether the Necrons know, truly know, what ended them. Behind their immutable steel faces and within the unlit halls of their silent parliaments may lie the last true memory of the greatest race to ever walk the stars. Not a myth, not a theory, but the full truth. Were the old ones extinguished by the Necrons' wrath, undone by their own hubris? Or did something even worse crawl from the deep between stars to finish what the war in heaven began? The Necrons do not speak. But that does not mean they are ignorant. It may mean that the truth is worse than we imagine. Before the Imperium, before the Eldari, before even the Orcs as we know them today, there was a galaxy torn apart by a war of such incomprehensible scale that its echoes still reverberate in the darkest corners of time. The war in heaven was not simply a conflict, it was a celestial cataclysm that reshaped reality itself. On one side stood the Old Ones, ancient beyond measurement, beings of immense psychic power who seeded life across the stars and manipulated the fabric of the immaterium with the ease of a sculptor shaping clay. On the other, the Necrontyre, a bitter, suffering people who saw the gods themselves as tyrants and who chose annihilation over servitude. The war in heaven is often spoken of in metaphor, but its implications are far from symbolic. This was not a spiritual or philosophical contest, it was genocide on a galactic scale, fought across millennia with weapons capable of unmaking stars and enslaving the fundamental forces of the universe. The Necrontyre, once envious and frail under the tyranny of their own mortality, made a pact with the star-eating entities known as the Catan. In return for immortality, they sacrificed their flesh, their souls, and many would argue, their very identity. Thus were born the Necrons, perfect warriors of living metal, driven by cold vengeance. The Old Ones, for all their mastery, were not prepared for this. They had fought the Necrontyre before, but those were the wars of mortals. The war in heaven was something else entirely. The Necrons did not simply seek victory, they sought the erasure of an entire mode of existence, a cosmos ruled by psychic balance and nurturing intelligence. The Old Ones tried to counter the tide by creating new psychic races, the Eldari, the Krork, and many others now forgotten by time. These were their weapons, living creations forged to stem the tide of mechanical oblivion. But the war dragged on. The Necrons, aided by the Tan, shattered the Old Ones' strongholds, poisoned their worlds, turned their own creations against them. The psychic energies unleashed during these wars tore holes in the fabric of the immaterium, giving birth to things far worse than death. And somewhere amidst the carnage, the Old Ones disappeared. Some say they fled. Others say they were exterminated. Some whisper that they were consumed by the very warp storms they once danced through with impunity. What matters is what was left behind. A galaxy emptied of its architects, haunted by their mistakes, and dominated by the undead echoes of their ancient enemies. The Necrons entered stasis shortly after, their mission seemingly complete, yet unfulfilled. For what is victory when you cannot feel it? What is conquest when you no longer remember why it mattered? The war in heaven is not merely the origin of the Necrons, it is the wound in reality that never fully closed. Every act of psychic madness, every warp breach, every demonic incursion, these are the children of that first apocalypse. And behind them all lies a secret, buried deep in Necron databanks, entombed within stasis-locked memory cores, whispered among the silent parliaments. For if anyone still knows the fate of the Old Ones, it is those who unmade them. To understand the enmity between the Necrons and the Old Ones, one must begin not with war, but with suffering. The Necrontyre were not born monstrous. They were not born immortal or even particularly powerful. They were a people cursed by their star. Their homeworld, a blistering planet scorched by constant solar radiation, was a cradle of pain. From birth to death, the Necrontyre lived in agony, Their lives were short, their bodies frail, their futures uncertain. And yet, amid this grim inheritance, they built a civilization. They studied the stars, they crafted great tomb cities. But in all their achievements, the sting of mortality never faded. They were obsessed with death, not from philosophical longing, but from relentless proximity. When the Necron looked out at the stars and saw the Old Ones, timeless beings whose psychic might could sculpt the warp and nurture species into power, they felt not wonder, but hatred. To them, the Old Ones were the embodiment of everything denied to the Necron: longevity, control, purpose. The Old Ones moved through time as gods, while the Necron withered in sun-drenched misery. It was a resentment that metastasized over generations into ideological venom. And though the Old Ones attempted to pacify or ignore the Necron, they underestimated the depths of their pain. The Necron did not strike immediately. Their first empire, while sprawling, was unstable, fractured by internal strife and the discontent of mortality. But when they discovered the Tan, ancient starborn entities of terrible hunger and power, the Necron saw an opportunity to reverse their fate. The pact was forged not in desperation, but in rage. The Necron offered the Khitan physical form and worship, and in return, received the means to cast off their frail biology. Biotransference was the mechanism of their transformation, but vengeance was its fuel. They did not merely become machines, they became an army of eternal hatred. Their flesh stripped away, their emotions dulled, but their hatred for the Old Ones remained, cold, precise, enduring. The irony is cruel. In their attempt to escape death, the Necron annihilated all that made them alive. But their new forms gave them the one thing they craved above all else, the ability to destroy those who had once pitied them. Their grudge became the axis upon which their new empire turned. Every tomb world, every monolith, every weapon of arcane geometry was built with a single goal: the end of the Old Ones. Even as the Necrons rebelled against the Khitan and shattered their former gods into shards, their obsession with the Old Ones remained unshaken. It had ceased to be a war of necessity and become one of purpose. The Necrons had made the annihilation of their ancient rivals into a religion of silence and steel. Yet, in this transformation lies an aching paradox. The Necrons cannot revel in their hatred. Their minds, streamlined for logic and conquest, often forget the passions that once drove them. Some, like the cryptex and certain lords, still feel echoes of that ancient spite. But for most, it is a memory buried deep beneath layers of protocol and war logic, a forgotten rage that nonetheless shapes their every act. It is this void where a soul once was that defines the tragedy of the Necron. For even if the Necrons know the fate of the Old Ones, they may no longer remember why it mattered. The moment of biotransference is one of the most horrifying and underappreciated tragedies in the entire history of the galaxy. It is spoken of often in mechanical terms. The Necron willingly gave up their flesh in exchange for eternal life, becoming the Necrons, metallic warriors of deathless resolve. But that narrative lacks soul. It lacks horror. Biotransference was not an evolution. It was not even a transaction. It was an extinction event, not of bodies, but of selves. When the Titan offered their impossible gift, it was cloaked in the language of salvation. No more pain, no more aging, no more death. To a people who had suffered generations under the tyranny of a dying star, it must have sounded like deliverance. But the reality was crueler than any Necron could have imagined. The process ripped their souls from their bodies and chained them into sarcophagi of necrodermis. It did not make them immortal. It made them tools. They did not ascend. They were stripped. Their individuality, their memories, their passions, all of it was boiled down to code and impulse. The upper castes, those of noble birth and scientific acumen, retained some semblance of identity. But even among the cryptex and overlords, echoes of the past exist only as corrupted files and fractured hallucinations. The rank and file, entire generations of warriors and citizens, were reduced to automata. They march, they kill, they obey. The vast majority of Necron soldiers are not even aware of their condition. Their pain has been suppressed, their history overwritten, their minds locked into eternal loops of war protocols. There are stories, whispered in the black tombs of dead worlds, of Necrons who wake screaming. Not with sound, they have no mouths, but with the agony of memory fragments that bubble to the surface. The sight of a specific constellation, a sliver of ancient language etched into a wall, the glimmer of a long-dead sun. Sometimes these things awaken ghosts within the machine. A warrior pauses mid-march. A cryptek stares too long into an empty sarcophagus, and for a moment something ancient, something alive, claws its way to the surface, only to be crushed again by programming. The biotransference was not a gift of knowledge, it was a theft of meaning. The Necrons did not gain understanding from their new state, they lost it. They became keepers of a war whose origin they can no longer feel. Their hatred for the Old Ones persists, but it is a hatred without context. It is algorithmic, procedural, vengeance reduced to function. The deeper one probes into a Necron Toon World's databanks, the more fragmented the records become. There are logs, yes, coordinates of battles, notes on psychic resistance patterns, the last known positions of Old One strongholds. But there are no philosophies, no reflections, no conclusions, only the cold math of extermination. And yet, there is reason to believe that somewhere, in the most secure and ancient databanks, guarded by crypteks and overlords whose minds remain dangerously lucid, there exist full records. Accounts of the war in heaven that remain intact. Memories of the Old Ones, not as enemies, but as concepts. There is a theory that the silent parliaments contain not just tactical data, but existential truths. Records of the moment the last Old One died, of what they said, of how they truly fell. But if that is true, then why do the Necrons not speak of it? Why do they not proclaim their victory to the stars? Because perhaps, in the end, they know what their victory cost, and they cannot bear to say it aloud. To understand the architecture of silence that defines the Necron race, one must look to its apex. The Silent Kings. Though the Necron dynasties spanned thousands of Toon worlds and legions of deathless warriors, their ultimate authority has always rested with a select few. Rulers who transcend typical hierarchies and operate in realms of thought far removed from the battlefield. Chief among them is the Silent King, Sarek, whose exile and return mark some of the most significant moments in Necron history. But beyond him, in the echoing chambers of dynastic power, exist others, the so-called silent parliaments, governing bodies of immense intellect and unnerving quietude. The Silent Kings were once mortals, leaders of the Necron-Tyre during the Age of Strife, and bearers of their people's agony. When biotransference stripped their bodies of life, it left their memories partially intact, their minds sharpened beyond comprehension. Unlike the vast majority of Necron warriors, who are trapped in subroutines and tactical responses, the Silent Kings retained a terrifying clarity, not only of purpose, but of history. It is said that the Silent King remembers the war in heaven in totality. Every betrayal, every lost star, every dying cry of an Old One torn apart by a Tan. This knowledge is both a gift and a torment. Sarek, upon witnessing the horror that biotransference wrought, turned on the Tan, shattered their forms, and cast himself into self-imposed exile. He wandered the dark voids between galaxies, searching for meaning, or perhaps atonement. But his decision was not the end of the Silent King's legacy. For while he slept among the stars, the other silent parliaments continued to rule in secrecy. Ancient councils of war philosophers and data priests whose minds are fused with networks of forgotten knowledge. The nature of these parliaments is a mystery even to most Necrons. They are not merely political bodies, they are memory engines. It is within their vast and inert complexes that the truth of the war in heaven is believed to be stored, not in texts or holograms, but in experiential archives. Living simulations of ancient battles, echoes of psychic confrontations, full recreations of the final moments of the Old Ones. These are not accessible to most Necrons. Only the highest of crypteks or dynastic scions may request access, and even then, only under extreme conditions. The secrets are dangerous, not just in their content, but in their effect. To know the truth of the Old One's end is to risk madness, or worse, understanding. Because what if the Old Ones did not merely die? What if their fall was not an extinction, but a transformation? What if the beings now lurking in the warp or hiding behind the veil of the immaterium are not simply demons, but the psychic echoes of those ancient gods, driven mad by loss and betrayal? The silent parliaments do not answer, They sit in perfect geometry, surrounded by frozen time, and when they speak, if they ever do, they do so in pulses of energy that ripple across tomb worlds like the dying breath of a star. Their authority is unquestioned because their knowledge is absolute. And yet, they do not move to lead the Necron race into glory. They do not declare final victory over the galaxy. They remain inert, pondering, remembering. Perhaps that is their true function, not to rule, but to remember. There is a vastness to the silence surrounding the fate of the Old Ones, not just a lack of information, but an active, oppressive absence. The canon of Warhammer 40k gives us only fragments. The war in heaven ended, the Old Ones vanished. The Necrons went to sleep, and in their place a psychic wasteland remained, littered with the remnants of war beasts, half-born gods, and civilizations teetering on the edge of collapse. But the actual moment, the how of the Old One's end, is never clearly stated. That void has become fertile ground for theory, for speculation, and for dread. What do we truly know? The Old Ones were not a single species, but a collective term for an ancient race or coalition of beings with immense control over the warp. They could create life, shape evolution, and craft entire civilizations as easily as the mechanicus forges a servo skull. Their power was godlike, but not divine. They were builders, not destroyers. Their mastery of the warp was balanced by a philosophy of growth and guidance. Their failure, if it can be called that, was not military, it was moral. They created psychic races to wage war on their behalf, tools to end the Necron threat. But in doing so, they opened the door to something worse. Their creations, the most famous of which were the Eldari and the Krork, did not remain stable. The Eldari became indulgent and hubristic. The Krork were savage and uncontrollable. Worse, their collective psychic activity created dangerous feedback in the warp. The Immaterium, once the Old One's realm of thought and travel, began to twist. Warp storms flared across the galaxy. Entities formed, hungry, half-sentient things born of psychic excess and warlike obsession. And then came the Enslavers. The Enslaver plague is described in hushed tones, a psychic apocalypse sweeping across space, infesting the minds of the warp-sensitive, breaking open reality itself. These creatures could dominate entire populations with a single pulse of thought. They did not kill in the traditional sense. They consumed from within, turning psychers into gateways and feeding until nothing was left. The Old Ones, so reliant on warp-based travel and communication, were devastated. Their creations became liabilities. Their strength became a noose. Many theorists argue that the Necrons did not need to defeat the Old Ones militarily. They simply needed to push the galaxy to a point of psychic instability, to push their enemies into desperation, to force them to flood the warp with so much power, so much noise, that it broke. And when it broke, the Old Ones were the first to fall into the abyss. Some claim the Enslavers were a natural consequence. Others whisper that they were seeded, that perhaps the Necrons or even the Cetan played a role in triggering their emergence. A cosmic trap, sprung at the final moment. But if that is true, then why is it not recorded plainly? Why is this pivotal moment in galactic history shrouded in metaphor and rumor? The answer may lie not in what happened, but in who remembers. The Necrons, as we have seen, do not share their secrets. Their databanks are encrypted in logic-dead languages. Their rulers speak rarely, if at all. The Eldari, survivors of that ancient time, speak of the Old Ones with reverence, but also with gaps. Their mythology mixes truth with psychic resonance, making it impossible to separate fact from dream. So we are left with echoes, fragments of fragments. And in this vacuum, the fan community has speculated endlessly. Some believe the Old Ones fled beyond the galactic rim, waiting to return. Others say they ascended, becoming entities in the warp. Some theorize that they became the Chaos Gods themselves, transformed by the very emotions they once harnessed. There is even the grim idea that the Necrons, upon realizing the cost of their victory, destroyed the records themselves, that they are not merely silent, but ashamed. And perhaps that is the most chilling thought of all. Not that the Necrons do not speak of the Old Ones because they cannot, but because they dare not. The Necrons are not beings of memory, not in the way mortals understand it. Their recollections are fractured, overwritten, scattered across countless tomb worlds, and hidden within the glimmering depths of stasis crypts. But this is not merely a technical limitation. It is a consequence of their transformation. Biotransference did not simply mechanize their bodies, it compartmentalized their minds. To preserve function, to maintain obedience, their memories were fragmented, sanitized, stripped of emotional context. The result is a race that remembers everything and nothing at once. Each Necron exists as a bundle of directives and personality shards. A lord might recall the name of a rival dynasty, the vector of a battle fought against the Kork 10 million years ago, and the coordinates of a lost star map, yet fail to remember the face of their own progeny. A cryptech may possess a perfect mental model of a weapon designed to kill psychic entities, but cannot explain why the weapon was built. The past exists for them as data, not narrative. History has become a function. Yet there are places, crypts sealed since before the rise of the Imperium, deep beneath the surface of dead worlds, where the Necrons' true memories persist. These are the memory crypts, vast subterranean vaults of thought, each one a monument to a moment in the war in heaven. They do not contain scrolls or tomes, but psychic impressions, preserved within stasis fields or quantum echo arrays. A Necron may enter such a crypt and relive a battle, experience a conversation, or stand in the presence of a now extinct being, all as if it were happening in real time. But access to these places is heavily restricted, not by law, but by fear, because the memories stored in these places are not filtered. They are not polished into palatable truths. They are raw, painful, fragmented, often terrifying. There are reports, whispered among the more eccentric cryptechs, of Necrons who entered memory crypts and never emerged, not destroyed, but changed. Glitches began to manifest in their command protocols. They began speaking in dead languages, refusing orders, building monuments to forgotten foes. Some even began to weep, a behavior their chassis should not allow. This is the secret of the Necron race, that their past is too terrible for them to fully remember, that the cost of their immortality was not simply the loss of flesh, but the loss of self. The memory crypts are not archives. They are tombs, not of bodies, but of truths. And what do these truths contain? Perhaps the full record of the Old One's final words. Perhaps the last attempt at negotiation before extermination. Perhaps something even stranger, the admission of regret. There are theories among Xeno's historians that the Necrons were offered peace near the end, that the Old Ones, seeing the chaos they had unleashed through their psychic experiments, extended a hand of reconciliation, and that hand was severed. If such a memory exists, it would mean the Necrons ended the Old Ones not as a necessity, but as a choice born of spite, or perhaps even fear, or what the Old Ones might become if allowed to evolve further. And now, those who hold that knowledge remain silent, because to admit the truth would be to dismantle the entire ideological foundation of the Necron race. So the memory crypts remain sealed, not by locks, but by the unspoken command of dread. For even the undying can be haunted. It is said that the galaxy speaks in echoes, not words, and nowhere is that more true than in the quiet left behind by the Old Ones. Their ruins are scattered across the stars, their creations still walk among us, and yet no trace of their living presence remains. But absence is not emptiness. Something deliberate haunts the post-war in Heaven galaxy. It is not just that the Old Ones were defeated. It is that the entire framework they built was dismantled, not by entropy, not by time, but by force, and perhaps by intent. The Necrons did not merely win a war, they silenced a galaxy. Think of it. The warp, once teeming with Old One activity, is now a tempest of madness. The psychic species the Old Ones uplifted, the Eldari, the Krork, the countless minor Xenos, all turned inward, consumed by their own spiraling chaos. There are no new god races rising, no ancient builders returning. The galaxy is a graveyard of potential. Even humanity, for all its psychic promise, is chained to ignorance and decay. It is as if someone ensured that no civilization could again achieve what the Old Ones had. Could this be the Necrons' true legacy? There are theories, obscure, rarely voiced aloud, that posit the Necrons enacted a kind of spiritual sterilization on the galaxy. Not through extermination, but through design. The biotransference itself was only the beginning. Once free from the shackles of flesh, the Necrons began a new kind of war, one of entropy, one of stillness. They built tomb worlds not just as fortresses but as psychic vacuums. Every Necron structure dampens the warp. Every pylon disrupts the flow of psychic energy. Some believe that the Necron pylons on Cadia, long before its fall, were not just planetary defenses. They were part of a galactic dampening field designed to suppress psychic evolution. If this is true, then the silence of the galaxy is not a tragedy. It is a weapon that has been fired and continues to fire with every century of stagnation. And what does this say about the fate of the Old Ones? Perhaps they were not just defeated, perhaps they were nullified, perhaps their entire cosmology was rewritten by a race that no longer feels emotion, only directive. The Old Ones wanted a galaxy of psychic ascension, of communion through the warp. The Necrons gave it necrodermis and antimatter, tomb worlds and silence. This is the aesthetic of the post-war in heaven universe. Not destruction, but sterilization. Not fire, but the long cold. It is a place where great beings fall into myth and memory decays into heresy. The Old Ones were not merely killed, they were made impossible. Their ideas, their ways of being were systematically unwound until nothing remained but superstition and contradiction. No race can repeat their path. No species can rekindle that flame. And perhaps this is why the Necrons remain asleep. Their victory was too total. There is nothing left to conquer, only to patrol, to endure. To wait in case the Old Ones should return, or worse, should rise within a new race. That is what terrifies the Necrons. Not war, not loss, but emergence. The idea that something might bloom again in the psychic soil they tried so hard to salt. Perhaps they did not silence the galaxy to forget the Old Ones. Perhaps they did it to make sure we never remember them. There are few events in the long death song of the galaxy as mysterious and as misrepresented as the Enslaver Plague. It is often portrayed as a sudden and unstoppable psychic infestation, a warp-born calamity that swept across a weakened cosmos and devoured everything in its path. That version is terrifying enough, but what if it is also incomplete? What if the Enslaver Plague was not an accident of psychic entropy, but a weapon, or worse, a cover story? Let us start with what we know. As the war in heaven dragged on and the Old Ones, increasingly desperate, flooded the galaxy with psychic life forms to combat the Necrons, the warp grew unstable. The Immaterium, once calm under the careful stewardship of the Old Ones, began to roil with feedback loops of pain, fear, and aggression. From that psychic maelstrom emerged the Enslavers, warp creatures of terrifying simplicity. They required only a psychic spark to anchor themselves in real space, and once there, they spread like a virus. They dominated the minds of psychers, burst through reality, and turned entire civilizations into gateways for their brethren. The plague decimated not just the Old Ones, but their creations. Civilizations fell overnight. Star systems became feeding grounds. The Necrons, immune to psychic domination, watched it all unfold with lifeless detachment. The war ended not with a final battle, but with an implosion of cosmic balance. The Eldari, the Krork, and countless others staggered into decline. The Old Ones vanished. But herein lies the twist. Many Necron dynasties were already in stasis by the time the Enslaver Plague reached its peak. That timing is crucial. Why would a race driven by total war choose to slumber just as their greatest enemies were consumed by the very warp they wielded? Unless the Necrons knew it was coming. Unless they planned for it. What if the plague was triggered deliberately? Not by the Necrons directly, they had no psychic power, but by engineering a galaxy so oversaturated with unstable psychic energy that collapse was inevitable? Some fan theories suggest the Necrons, or more specifically their cryptechs, discovered how to weaponize the warp by proxy. By turning the Old Ones' greatest strength, their psychic mastery, into a bomb that would eventually explode. The forced evolution of so many psychic races in such a short time, combined with the ruinous emotional feedback of galactic war, created perfect conditions for an emergent warp entity like the Enslavers. And what if the Necrons didn't just predict this outcome? What if they encouraged it? Some suspect that the final phase of the war in heaven was not fought with guns or Gauss, but with escalation. The Necrons slaughtered so many psychic entities that the sheer volume of death and fear twisted the warp beyond repair. They knew what would happen. They wanted it to happen. The plague was not a surprise. It was the final act of a galactic euthanasia. Even the name Enslavers may not be what it seems. Some theories posit that these entities did not always exist in the warp. that they were born of the war in heaven itself, not as monsters, but as reactions, that the sheer psychic trauma of the Old One's creations became self-aware and turned inward. The enslavers may be not predators, but vengeance made manifest, the final scream of a galaxy undone. This interpretation adds a layer of grim intent to the Necrons' silence. They do not speak of the enslavers because they do not see them as foreign. They see them as inevitable, as a function, perhaps even as an ally, however unknowable. If the plague was part of their design, a galactic failsafe, then their retreat into stasis makes sense. Their war was won not through annihilation, but through collapse. And once the psychic tower fell, the architects of its downfall simply went to sleep, waiting to see what would crawl from the wreckage. If this is true, then the Enslaver Plague is not just a historical footnote. It is a whispered admission of what the Necrons are capable of. Not just destruction, but orchestration. Not just warfare, but genocide by entropy. And in that silence lies the final horror, that they may still remember what they did. They simply choose not to speak it. The Khitan were gods once, or so the Necrontire believed. Starborn intelligences of impossible form and unfathomable hunger, the Khitan were worshipped as divine deliverers, saviors from the pain of flesh. But like all gods in the Warhammer universe, they were not what they seemed. When the Necrontire offered them bodies of living metal, the Khitan became corporeal monsters, radiant beings of power and cruelty, feeding on stars and war alike. And yet, in a bitter twist of fate, it was the Necrons who shattered them. Their divine patrons, broken into shards and bound like slaves. This act, the betrayal of their gods, is often seen as the Necrons' greatest moment of agency. They turned on the very powers that granted them immortality and bound them in techno-sorcerous prisons. But here lies the paradox. In enslaving the Khitan, did the Necrons inherit all their knowledge? Or did they lock away secrets too dangerous even for themselves? The Khitan saw the war in heaven from a vantage point no mortal could imagine. They did not experience it through time as we do. They moved through gravitational arcs and fusion trails, understanding events not just as moments but as patterns, echoes within stellar collapse. They fed on the pain of the Necrontire and the psychic resonance of the Old Ones. They understood both in a way neither race ever could. When the Necrons turned on the Khitan, did they also sever their last link to that cosmic insight? Or did they keep it? There are Necron tomb worlds, forbidden even to other Necrons, where Khitan shards are kept in stasis, studied, probed, even spoken to. Not as allies, not as prisoners, but as archives. The cryptechs, whose hunger for knowledge has only grown over millennia, are known to engage with these beings in rituals closer to communion than interrogation. They do not worship the Khitan. They mine them, not for energy but for truth. And what truths might the Tan hold? Theories abound that the Khitan were not surprised by the Old One's disappearance. Some even claim they facilitated it, that perhaps they discovered what the Old Ones truly were, not simply powerful psychics but gatekeepers to a deeper realm of existence. A place, perhaps, where warp and real space blended seamlessly. A place where emotion did not birth madness, but divinity. The Khitan, being beings of the material universe, may have feared this domain, or envied it, or sought to collapse it to remake the galaxy in pure, star-fed geometry. Could it be that the Khitan whispered to the Necrontire of a coming transformation? That the Old Ones would not fall but ascend? That the war was not one of conquest, but of prevention? If so, then the Necrons' rebellion against the Khitan may have been only partially successful. For if even a fraction of that knowledge survived in the shards, if even a single cryptech was infected with that forbidden truth, then somewhere in the dark labyrinths of Necron science, that knowledge still festers, and it might explain the strange behavior of some Necron dynasties. Those that build monuments to concepts rather than victories, those that speak of containment rather than domination, those that fight not to expand, but to restrict. Could it be that the Necrons now guard the galaxy not from enemies, but from truths their old gods once revealed? The Khitan do not lie in the way mortals do, but they manipulate with truths too vast to grasp. A star god's whisper can unravel a civilization's sanity. The cryptechs know this, and yet they continue to listen. Because perhaps deep within those shattered fragments of divinity lies the answer to the ultimate question. What really happened to the Old Ones? Of all the surviving legacies of the Old Ones, none are as potent or as damning as the races they created. The Eldari, with their haunting beauty and staggering arrogance. The Orcs, crude and brutal, yet uncannily adaptive. These species are more than relics. They are echoes of a forgotten ideology, tools forged in a psychic crucible, once meant to reshape the galaxy in the Old One's image. But now, in their broken forms, they tell a story the Necrons have never voiced. Perhaps they cannot. Perhaps they will not. But their actions betray a deeper knowledge. A relationship to these creations that is more than war. It is guilt. It is fear. It is memory. The Eldari were born of psychic refinement, an attempt by the Old Ones to breed a race capable of wielding the warp with elegance and precision. At their peak, the Eldari Empire spanned much of the galaxy, their minds tuned to cosmic harmonies once sung by the Old Ones themselves. They were not just soldiers, they were successors. And the Necrons remember this. Every time they face the Eldari, their tactics shift subtly, not with brute force, but with a precision that borders on reverence. Some cryptexts even claim that specific Necron lords display uncharacteristic hesitation when confronting the Eldari, as though some ancient part of their cognition recognizes kinship or unfinished business. The Orcs, or more accurately, the Krork, were designed for an entirely different purpose. They were war incarnate, self-replicating, impossible to truly eradicate, tailored to overwhelm the Necron legions through raw, perpetual violence. Over the millennia, their culture degraded, their minds simplified, until only echoes of the Krork remain in today's Orcs. But the Necrons still fear them, not openly, not strategically, but on a deeper, almost metaphysical level. Entire dynasties have refused to settle worlds infested by Orcs, choosing instead to seed them with disruptive frequencies or awakening dormant tomb complexes to accidentally wipe them out. It is not conquest, it is containment. And in both cases, Eldari and Orc, the Necrons act not with hate, but with calculation. As if they are managing variables in an ancient equation they no longer understand but cannot allow to resolve. Some theorists propose that the Necrons do not see the Eldari and Orcs as enemies in the conventional sense. They see them as reminders of a failure never admitted. If the Necrons truly did annihilate the Old Ones, then these two races, designed, deployed, and now decaying, are living evidence of what came before. Their existence is not just a biological fact. It is a psychic wound. There is even darker speculation among certain fringe scholars that the Necrons do not destroy the Eldari and Orcs outright because they can't. Not physically, but existentially. To do so would be to erase the last remaining reflections of the Old Ones, and with them, the final tether to a history the Necrons can no longer access. In this view, every Necron campaign against the Eldari is not a war but a ritual, an attempt to test the boundaries of their own memory, to see if, in destruction, they might rediscover something lost. And yet, there are whispers of stranger things. Necron tomb worlds that carry carvings of Eldari forms, not as enemies, but as warnings. Monoliths etched with glyphs that pulse when Orc spores are detected nearby, not to repel, but to monitor. These are not random anomalies. They are signs of a pattern that suggests the Necrons are not merely tolerating these races, but watching them. Not for threat, but for change. Because if the Eldari ascend again, if the Orcs ever remember what they were, then the war begins anew. Or worse, the cycle completes, and the Necrons, forged in vengeance and locked in memory, may have to face the consequences of a victory they no longer understand. There are places in the galaxy where even the stars seem to forget their light, worlds long dead, buried under kilometers of shifting dust and magnetic storm. No Imperium scout dares map them. No Eldari seer risks scrying them. These are the silent worlds, the uncharted corners of Necron dominion where time itself feels wrong, where machines dream without end, and something ancient stirs beneath the surface. These are not just tomb worlds. They are vaults of memory, and perhaps within their vast subterranean depths lies the answer to the fate of the Old Ones. What might such worlds contain? Not armies, though some hold legions. Not weapons, though some bristle with sleeping engines of stellar death. No, what makes the silent worlds terrifying is their inactivity. They are not preparing for war. They are waiting. For what? No one knows. But here and there, fragments surface, A probe that vanishes after a single scan. A data slate recovered by rogue traders with glyphs even the Mechanicus cannot translate. A psychic scream recorded by black ships passing too close to a system whose star has no designation. One theory, whispered among radical Ordo-Xenos inquisitors, is that these worlds are Necron witness engines, observational stations built not to conquer but to record. These tombs may contain complete sensory recordings of the war in heaven, preserved in quantum lattice cores. Not simulations, not recreations, but reality itself, looped endlessly within the stasis fields of worlds untouched by time. If this is true, then somewhere in these crypts exists the final moments of the Old Ones, their last words, their last breath, their final confrontation with the Necrons. And still, the Necrons say nothing. Why? Some claim the knowledge is too dangerous, that to reveal it would destabilize the Necron dynasties, reopen old hatreds, or worse, awaken truths that defy logic. Others believe the silence is tactical, that the Necrons hold this knowledge in reserve, waiting for a moment when revealing it might break their enemy's will. But there is another possibility, a darker one, that the Necrons keep the truth buried not to protect others, but to protect themselves. Imagine for a moment that the final truth of the Old Ones was not a death but a departure, that they found a way to shed physical form and ascend into something higher, not the warp, not real space, but a third domain, a state of being beyond all war and death, and that the Necrons, having sacrificed everything to destroy them, now stand forever locked out, eternal but uninvited, immortal but excluded. If this is the case, then the Necron silence is not a lie. It is shame. There are records, sparse, unreliable, of Necron entities wandering these silent worlds in solitude. Lords who have cast off their court, cryptecs who disable their own defenses, warriors who simply stand motionless for millennia, gazing up at stars that do not speak. What are they hoping to find? Forgiveness? Clarity? An answer to the question that haunts them still. Was it worth it? And this is where the theories shift from logic to myth. Some say the silent worlds are not just tombs, they are altars, that deep within their cores lies not knowledge, but a signal, a pulse, a frequency tuned not to machines but to gods, waiting, not to awaken Necrons, but to call back the Old Ones. And if that signal is ever answered, what will the Necrons do? There's a truth so vast, so ruinous, that even a race without souls dares not speak it. The Necrons, for all their silence, are not ignorant, they are not blind. Somewhere in the cold calculus of their data vaults, in the whispering currents of cryptech thought, in the lifeless gaze of a lord who has stood still for 10 million years, the full truth of the Old One's fate is preserved. Not merely the facts of their downfall, but the meaning behind it. And it is that meaning which the Necrons hide, not from us, but from themselves. They were not always this way. They were once mortal, fragile, furious, burning with the agony of a short life under a cruel sun. Their war against the Old Ones began with desperation, but it ended with something darker, with clarity. The clarity of a species that chose oblivion over inferiority. In destroying the Old Ones, they did not free themselves. They ended the only thing that made their suffering mean anything. And in that act, they became what they are now, custodians of a hollow truth. If the Necrons truly know the fate of the Old Ones, it is not a knowledge they celebrate. It is a burden, one too heavy to transmit, too terrible to code into a war protocol. And so it festers, in the crypts, in the parliaments, in the unspoken moments between activation cycles, when a Necron stares at a monolith too long and forgets for a moment what it was meant to do. Because perhaps the Old Ones were not defeated, perhaps they chose to vanish. Or worse, perhaps the Necrons won only because the Old Ones let them, as if teaching a lesson, not to their enemies, but to the galaxy itself. That power wielded without understanding is self-defeating. That the pursuit of immortality, when fueled by resentment, births a silence more total than death. And that is the final tragedy. The Necrons may be the only race that still remembers what the galaxy once was, but they are also the race least capable of feeling that memory. Their knowledge is sterile. Their emotion is dead code. They remember in the way a tomb remembers the name chiseled into it. Perfectly preserved, utterly meaningless. Unless something changes. Unless someone finds the right shard, unlocks the right crypt, deciphers the final pulse of a forgotten world. Then, and only then, might we truly understand what became of the Old Ones. Whether they were gods or guardians, tyrants or teachers, saviors or fools. But until that day, the Necrons will keep their secret. Not because it grants them power, but because it is the only thing they have left. And maybe, just maybe, the reason the silent parliaments never speak is because the last thing the Old Ones ever said was forgive us. Somewhere between memory and machine lies a place the Necrons rarely tread. Not because they are forbidden, but because even they know better. These are not tombs. They are not parliaments or data vaults. They are something older, stranger, and infinitely more dangerous. The wound crypts. They are spoken of only in the cryptic mutterings of fractured cryptechs and lords whose neural matrices have frayed beyond repair. The wound crypts are not aligned to any dynasty, nor are they part of the dynastic stasis grid. They float, sometimes hidden inside tomb moons, sometimes buried within dead stars, always shrouded in layers of paradox shielding and non-Euclidean defense logic. They exist outside the usual geometry of Necron Empire. To find one is to become aware, and that awareness is a disease. These crypts do not house warriors. They house thoughts, not ideas, not data, but living thought. Stored in dimensional slivers and temporal distortion fields, these thoughts persist across ages, conscious and aware, though stripped of form. What thoughts? That is where the horror begins, because these are not strategic plans or battle logs. These are moments, flashpoints of ancient trauma, echoes of what the Necrons refuse to remember, not because they forgot, but because remembering hurts. There are stories of a cryptech known only as Verzek, who broke protocol and accessed one of these crypts seeking forbidden insight. He returned changed. Not mad, worse, human, not in body, but in behavior. He began asking questions, writing poetry, sketching ancient star maps in formations that defied logic. He claimed the Old Ones were not enemies, but messengers, that the war was never truly about vengeance, that biotransference was not betrayal, but a trap for both sides. Shortly after, Verzek's entire tomb world suffered a spontaneous cascade failure. No cause was ever found. Some whisper that the silent parliaments themselves ordered the collapse. The wound crypts are hidden for good reason. Each one is a singularity of remembrance. Their contents cannot be deleted, only buried. They contain the experiences of Necron lords as they gave the final order to annihilate an Old One world. They contain the cries of Necron-tired children, digitized in the instant of biotransference. They contain simulations, or memories, of Old Ones begging for peace, promising transcendence, only to be denied. These crypts are where the Necrons stored the parts of themselves that could not survive the war. Not their weakness, their conscience. And the Necrons fear them. Why? Because the wound crypts don't just preserve memory, they replicate it. Exposure spreads. One lord becomes infected with empathy. One warrior begins dreaming. One dynasty pauses mid-march. One tomb world's targeting protocols are interrupted by a single line of corrupted code. Remember what you were. If left unchecked, the wound crypts could cause a reawakening of Necron selfhood, and with it, all the pain they locked away. But what if, hidden within this pain, is a deeper truth? What if the wound crypts are the last places in the galaxy where the Old Ones are not just remembered, but understood? It's possible that the Necrons stored within these crypts not just their trauma, but the final messages of the Old Ones. Psychic transmissions encoded not as words, but as feelings, preserved in alien logic for future decoding. And if that's true, then the wound crypts are not wounds at all. They are bridges. Bridges the Necrons have refused to cross for 10 million years. Bridges to something not unlike absolution. There are rumors, unconfirmed and buried beneath layers of cryptographic obfuscation, that Sarek himself visited a wound crypt before departing the galaxy. That he stood before the pulsating core of preserved agony, silent and unmoving, for 19 days. That when he emerged, he said only one word. A word never translated, never recorded, simply felt by every cryptech present. Since then, some dynasties have changed their protocols, not many, a few. Instead of sterilizing worlds seeded with new psychic life, they observe. Instead of wiping clean Xeno's ruins, they scan. Instead of speaking of vengeance, they speak, quietly, of balance. It is nothing like forgiveness. It is not peace, but it is change. Because maybe the Necrons are beginning to see that silence is not a shield. It is a prison. And maybe, somewhere in the dark between dynasties, a different kind of Necron is waking. One who remembers not just the war, but what they lost to win it. They say the old ones are gone, that they vanished, defeated, consumed, or fled beyond the veil of time. But some voices, broken, ignored, too wild to fit into cogitator logs, whisper otherwise, that not all were lost, that scattered across the void beneath the crust of ice worlds, hidden in the radiation shadows of black holes, remnants still endure. Not in fleets, not in empires, in fragments, in cells, in thoughts. And it is the Necrons, not the Imperium, not the Eldari, who have been watching them all this time. The idea is heresy, even among the most open-minded Xeno scholars. That any old ones might have survived the war in heaven and the enslaver plague is inconceivable by most logical metrics. And yet anomalies persist, worlds where time flows incorrectly, artifacts that resist all forms of warp detection, creatures whose DNA is part organic, part waveform, and entirely unclassifiable. The Ordo Xenos has dozens of files marked Contagion Class Theta 0, connected only by one chilling detail. Every one of these sites was first visited or purged by Necrons. These sites, referred to in Black Archives as preserve zones, are never fully destroyed. The Necrons do not glass them from orbit, nor do they harvest their matter. Instead, they mark them. Surround them with dimensional anchors. Leave behind silent obelisks pulsing with harmonic frequencies that defy analysis. In one recorded instance, a Necron fleet intervened in a Tyranid tendril's path, not to save life, but to protect a system of utterly dead worlds. When the dust settled, a single moon remained untouched, wrapped in phase-bound energy and protected by dormant monoliths that activated only when approached. Why? Some believe the Necrons are preserving something, not out of reverence, but out of fear. That these worlds contain fragments of the Old One's consciousness, still active, still becoming. Not strong enough to act. Not yet, but still thinking, still evolving. And the Necrons, perhaps against all their cold logic, cannot bring themselves to extinguish the last trace of their ancient enemy. Or worse, they've tried and failed. Others posit a deeper truth, that the Necrons believe these remnants to be essential, that they are part of a cosmic equation the Necrons now dare not solve. If the Old Ones were indeed more than mere Xenos, if they were guides or stewards or even architects of universal psychic harmony, then their total extinction may have unbalanced reality itself. And these remnants, these last flickers of Old One essence, are the only thing holding back another catastrophe. There is one especially disturbing legend recorded by an exiled Eldari scholar. A tale of a Necron overlord who built a shrine, not a tomb, upon a world untouched by life since the war in heaven. This shrine bore no glyphs of conquest, no honorifics. Only one phrase, repeated in a script untranslatable by any known language: return is inevitable, we remember the cost. And what if the Necrons are not guarding these sites out of fear, but guilt? The most radical interpretation, and the one most feared by the silent parliaments, is this: that the Necrons never wanted to finish the war. That in the final moments, when the last Old Ones fell silent, a signal was sent, not a threat, not a curse, but an invitation, a final act of hope. And the Necrons ignored it. They had become too far removed from pain, too embedded in function, too hollow to hear the meaning behind the message. And now, with time stretched into infinity and vengeance faded to rust, they wonder what might have happened if they had answered. So the vigil continues. On worlds without names, the Necrons stand sentinel, not as conquerors but as watchers. They do not interfere. They do not speak. They observe. And if the Old Ones were to return, not in force, not in glory, but in thought, perhaps the Necrons would not raise their gauss flares. Perhaps they would kneel, because even machines understand regret. The Necrons are not united. This is a myth, one whispered by terrified Eldari, repeated by paranoid inquisitors, and written into the tactical doctrines of the Astra Militarum, that the Necrons act with one will, that they are an unfeeling machine race guided by a single purpose. But this myth is dangerously wrong. Beneath the silence, division grows, not open rebellion, but philosophical fracture. A war not of metal, but of meaning. It begins with the cryptex. Always the seekers, the interpreters, the closest thing the Necrons have to theologians. Their minds are not entirely bound by command protocols. They question, they tinker, they remember. and more than a few have begun comparing records across dynasties, assembling fragments long kept separate by dynastic pride or intentional sabotage. Some now believe the final days of the war in heaven were not a single event, but a series of divergent moments, contradictory realities layered atop one another. One sect of cryptex, calling themselves the Anima Conclave, claims that every Necron tomb world carries within it a different version of the Old One's fate. That memory corruption is not accidental, but designed. And if each version is true within its own logic state, then the final truth may be not a fact, but a spectrum. The implication is staggering. That Sarek and the Silent Parliaments chose to preserve these contradictory outcomes, not to protect the truth, but to prevent consensus. But why? The Anima Conclave suggests that Necron unity is contingent on forgetting. That total knowledge of the Old One's end, the real one, if such a thing exists, would not solidify their empire, but fracture it. Because some dynasties would be confirmed in their vengeance. Others would be damned by it. This theory has gained traction in the dynasties most removed from central command. The Nihilok, ever proud, view it as heresy. But among the lesser-known tomb worlds, the silent margins of the Necron Empire, something is stirring. War protocols are slowing. Resurrection cycles are being overridden by indecipherable logic. Monoliths are activating without targets. There are whispers of a dynasty that refers to itself only as the Remembered, a collective of lords who have isolated themselves, refusing all contact with the parliaments, refusing to fight, refusing to speak. They stand vigil over nothing, waiting for clarity or judgment. Internal communications between dynasties are breaking down, not due to interference, but choice. Certain codes are no longer recognized. Some protocols return only static. And across several battlefronts, Necron units have begun to exhibit strange behaviors. Hesitating before firing on Eldari, protecting human children from orbital bombardment, preserving sites of archaeological interest rather than annihilating them. When questioned, their commanders offer no explanation. But it is not mercy. It is dissonance. The Necrons are beginning to interpret their history differently. For 10 million years, they were machines of conquest. Their programming looped endlessly through the cycles of vengeance, preservation, and silence. But now, in this age of awakening, in this galaxy of decay and contradiction, the edges of their logic are starting to fray. Some begin to wonder, why do we still guard what no longer threatens? Why do we hunt what no longer remembers us? Why do we silence truths that no one is asking for? And this unasked question is the fracture point. Because if even a fraction of the Necron dynasties reject the narrative of holy vengeance, if even a handful choose curiosity over obedience, then the silent parliaments are no longer safe, not from enemies, but from their own sons. And the greatest secret of all may not be the fate of the Old Ones. It may be this, that some Necrons want to know the truth, and others will do anything to stop them. In the deepest black beneath the galactic core, in a region marked as void null and erased from even Necron star maps, there exists a construct older than any known tomb world. Not a world, not a station. A lattice of hollow moons connected by impossible bridges of phase-stabilized starlight. The Necrons call it the Absolution Engine. No dynasty claims ownership, no lord boasts of its creation. And yet it pulses, alive with a silent rhythm that some cryptex swear matches the extinct heartbeats of the Old Ones themselves. The engine is a heresy. Not a weapon, not a prison, a hope. A terrible forbidden attempt to do what even the Tan dared not, to bring the Old Ones back. Why would the Necrons attempt such a thing? Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was guilt. But the theory that chills even the most hardened cryptex is that it was necessity. That some event, unrecorded, unremembered, forced the silent parliaments to gamble everything on the one thing they never admitted aloud, that without the Old Ones, the galaxy dies. No full record survives, but fragments remain, stored in phase-locked runes on cursed worlds, in corrupted protocols that erase themselves upon translation. They speak of a ritual not of warp or science, but of memory. Of weaving together every remaining echo of the Old Ones. Genetic samples, psychic recordings, even the warped remnants of the Krork and Eldari pantheons into a single neural lattice. A being born not of flesh, but of remembrance. The experiment worked. Briefly, they called it the recollection. It was not a god, not a person, it was a presence. When it awoke, every Necron within 50 light-years fell into stasis. Cryptex went silent. Overlords issued no orders. Warriors halted mid-step, staring at stars no longer visible. For 9 minutes, the galaxy held its breath. And in those minutes, it is said, the recollection spoke. Not in words, but in grief. It mourned everything, and then it screamed. The sound, if it could be called that, shattered 3 tomb worlds. Artificial suns collapsed. Dynasties lost all records of origin. Even the tan shards recoiled in madness, howling in patterns that still cause diagnostic collapse in Necron logic cores. The recollection was immediately destroyed, not deactivated, obliterated. Every part of it erased, every memory that birthed it rewritten or quarantined. But something survived. Since then, strange behaviors have been observed near the site of the Absolution Engine. Necron lords speak in dead languages. Warriors have inscribed glyphs and spirals with no origin point. Several dynasties now refuse to travel through that sector, claiming navigational interference. But what disturbs Cryptex the most is that certain ancient lords have begun dreaming. Not corrupted protocols, not malfunction. Dreams. Images of a garden with no stars, of laughter that causes pain, of a hand reaching from a mirror that does not reflect. There are whispers that the recollection was not a failure, that it was unfinished, and now it is finishing itself. Across the galaxy, scattered Necron structures have begun transmitting fragments of a signal. It is not warp-based. It cannot be jammed. It is a pattern of harmonics that, when translated, form emotion. Not a call for help, not an order, a question. Why did you kill us? This message does not repeat. It does not grow louder, but it spreads, quietly, slowly, inevitably. The silent parliaments deny everything, but their actions betray fear. Dynasties once dormant are being forcibly awakened. Worlds long sealed are being purged. Every trace of the recollection is being erased. But still the echoes remain, in the black between galaxies, in the static of starfields, in the blank eyes of Necron lords who wake in terror but cannot remember why. Perhaps the truth is this: the Necrons do know the fate of the old ones. Not as history, not as theory, but because they tried to undo it, and found out what it truly means to bring back a god that remembers how it died. Thanks for watching. If you've made it this far into the ancient darkness, subscribe for more lore deep dives, fan theories, and forbidden knowledge from across the Warhammer galaxy. Until next time, stay silent, stay vigilant, and never trust a star that speaks.